Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Underrated Movie Podcast. This is a podcast where we discuss films that are underrated, underappreciated, and ones that have just slipped under the radar and passed most people by. I am your host, Derek McDuff, and joining me today is a returning guest, good buddy of mine, Kurosh Jozavi. How's it going, Kurosh?
I'm morbid, man. It's good. You know.
The real fans will get that one.
I'm good. Thank you for having me back on the show. Always a pleasure, and especially I'm excited for this episode to join. But yeah, my name's Kurosh. Thanks for having me. If you're not familiar, I do my own little thing with game reviews and indie game developer conversations on my YouTube channel at Cujo Prime. So
definitely check all Kurosh's stuff out. He's got a lot of really great content. Subscribe there and all the places. Check him out on Instagram and all the good stuff. But yeah, as you alluded to, today is going to be a good episode because this is the grand finale of the miniseries that I've been doing here called Extended Edition, where we're looking at alternate cuts of movies. And of course, this one is going to be Ridley Scott's director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven. Kingdom of Heaven has been originally released theatrically in 2005, like I said, directed by Ridley Scott. The first produced screenplay by Billy Monahan, starring a ensemble cast of Orlando Bloom, Eva Green, Jeremy Irons, David Thewlis, Brendan Gleeson, Martin Kosaks, Ed Norton, Liam Neeson, and, I mean, I'm probably butchering this, Ghassan Masad, but yeah,
there's a ton of amazing actors in this film.
Dude, it is like people just keep coming up, and I'm just like, I was like, oh shit, Jeremy Irons is in this too. You know, like
it's like people were big back then that were like obviously the stars and stuff. But then you look at like Jamie Lannister, the Nikolaj Coster. He was in a small bit role at the beginning, and I was like, okay, yeah. So it was like the foundation for several other people too who are now stars. So
yeah, like Michael Sheen, in this who famously, he's very very quickly in the theatrical, but has a much bigger role in the director's cut. But yeah, Kurosh, we kind of talked about this before last time you were on with Gangs in New York, and you're saying this is one of your favorite epics, and I had already the wheels were already kind of turning for me to want to do this miniseries, and when you said this, I was like, all right, I'm gonna have Kurosh on to talk Kingdom of Heaven.
I appreciate it. It's one of my favorites, and I didn't realize this is the finale. So this is even more. I feel like we're heading towards a grand epic here.
Right, exactly.
But no, I love this movie. I did. For me, it's funny because I only know the director's cut. I never saw this in theaters. I went through this period in my youth where it was like the beginnings of, I mean, it was still like many nowadays will maybe not understand, but before streaming services, it was all rentals. And I would go to the video store and they had this deal where it's like you could always just get 2 at a time, but you're on like a plan. So it's almost like early day Netflix. And I was at that point where I'm like, I feel like I've missed out on a bunch of movies. And I want to just like soak it all in. So I was watching Saving Private Ryan. I was watching Godfather's trilogy. I was watching Schindler's List, all these other things. And I remember one day I saw this one on the shelf, and it was the director's cut. It was like the double VHS, or no, at that point it was DVD. And I was enamored. I was like, this is amazing. I loved every bit of it. And I was like, just no one I knew had known of it. So it was just very much like, Dad, watch this. And he was into it, but no one at school or none of my social circles really knew of it. So when you start talking, I'm like, hey, there are people out there that love this movie.
Yeah, and I definitely knew its like reputation of the director's cut being better than the theatrical because I had seen the theatrical first. One of my best friends back in college, I was like at his house and he's like, let's watch Kingdom of Heaven. And I watched it and I was like, like there's some good stuff in it, but it felt very truncated, It hits all the same beats for the most part, but it's just kind of like pretty much instead of being like a big ensemble like we talked about, like those characters are all in it, it really just focuses on Balin, Orlando Bloom's story, and just kind of like is a very by the numbers. Things just feel like they're rushed, which interestingly enough, when I like watched Ridley Scott's Napoleon, I was like, it felt the same way in theaters. I was like, all right, I bet this guy's got like because he's talking about having like a 4-hour version like in the can, and just like I'm like I got to see that version because this version felt rushed. In the
Yeah.
same way that when I saw Kingdom of Heaven, I was like, there's clearly something here, but it is just kind of going through the beats. And yeah, then when I watched the director's cut, I was
Yeah.
like, it went from like a 3-star movie to like a 4.5-star movie. Like this
Nice.
movie isn't like nearly perfect to me. Like, yeah,
True. True.
it's a real epic. You know, it's truly just like this story that is this grand sweeping scale that was kind of on the way out in 2005 that we don't get a ton of anymore.
Yeah.
You know, Ridley Scott, I feel like maybe can still has the juice to still make it, but I feel like a lot of directors aren't going to get they're not going to be like able to go to Morocco and get like 5,000 extras and build an entire castle in the middle of the desert.
Right. The way he was able to get this like pitched out and everything and get just studios to back him, I think not. Yeah, you're right. Like not many can do that. Pull that
Yeah.
feat off. It's funny to me because he's famously said like the director's cut is his definite. He's like he does not stand by the theatrical cut at all. And I think it make looking into what they cut out, I'm like, I don't see how this movie made any sense to viewers in certain major arcs without those bits.
Right, yeah, because they cut out the entire kid to the point where I was watching some of the behind the scenes stuff because I went and got the like 2 discs, like Blu-ray, whatever, from
Mm.
my local library, which shout out to local libraries, they're great. But I watched all the bonus features and they talk about like even in the scripting phase, there was like the studio was like, we want to get rid of this whole kid storyline because they're like, it doesn't really add to Balin, it doesn't like necessarily move the plot along. So they wrote 2 scripts, like one with kid and one without kid is what they called it.
Mm.
And they were like on the fence, like, do we have the kid? And they're like, you know what? Fuck it, let's put the kid in. This it might not like like move the plot forward necessarily, but we need it to understand the characters. You know, Ava Green's character Sevilla, like it's so important to her. It's so important to understanding the themes of the movie. So they shot it, and then eventually it ended up getting cut out. All that stuff ended up getting cut out of the theatrical version, with along with about 45 other minutes of stuff that ended up getting put back into the director's cut.
Right.
And I think, yeah, that was, that's, all that thematic stuff is very important for understanding the movie. And one of the editor, I think it was mentioned, like she's like, it wasn't a narrative. It still made narrative sense, but it made less emotional sense. Was a
Right.
really good way of putting it.
There is a favorite line in this movie. Like this movie, it is an epic in a lot of the ways, and I think there are certain beats that I'm like, okay, it's kind of going through emotion, but there's certain moments, just like the heart and the moments of everything of when Godfrey is asking for forgiveness, or when Sibylla is seeing her son's like hand. That those little like it was always those little subtle moments that I was like, oh, there's like the heart of the film, or there's the kind of like the real challenges that it's facing, like this larger confrontation or challenge of like Jerusalem and religion and conflict and everything. That to me was more than anything like the backdrop, and it was all these little encounters that are like battles of the heart of what is right and wrong in these little encounters that culminate into where characters end up. That I was like, oh, okay. It does this. He did such a good job, and the team did such a good job of like making this epic, but making it almost secretly like this drama that is just like the nuances of like a gentle drama that wouldn't get a budget this big.
Right, yeah, and I think that's a lot of the best epics are ones that are so focused on characters, and these emotional journeys that characters go on. And to bring up another just grand epic set in the desert, Lawrence of Arabia is one of the greatest movies of all time, partially because it is this great, awesome epic with like these crazy battles and stuff like that, but also partially because you really care about the journey that Lawrence goes on. But it feels like in this, it's a lot more, compare it to Lawrence of Arabia, this feels a lot more like modern. Obviously, it is a more modern movie, but in Lawrence, it's like he's kind of like this white savior character who ends up like kind of failing at the end. Whereas this is like it's a really interesting dynamic between these 2 groups of people, and it's like, can peace really be achieved here? and it's a question that is still ongoing in the Middle East and many parts of the world today. And I think that's part
Yeah.
of the reason why Ridley Scott wanted to make this movie. And I love the whole dynamic between Saladin and the Leper King. Like whenever
Yeah.
they like meet, like that to speak what you're saying about like it being a drama, just like their interactions are so poignant, and just kind of like the gesturing that all like these people are doing, where they're trying to like the dynamics between Sevilla and her husband Guy are just really interesting. And then when you remove the kid from that, it doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah, to me, the to touch on the storyline with Sibylla and her son, I feel like it didn't seem consequential until things started to erupt towards the end, where the Leper King passes,
Hmm.
her son falls next in line, Balin makes decisions of whether to try to do the little harm to do the greater good, as Sibylla says, and then just kind of tumbling into an erupting like ending where it's like it takes her character of like she loses her son, she sees the path he's going to go down, the whole world kind of hinges on these things, and then it just all kind of snowballs into the larger ramifications that affect everyone. I like that like all these, well, more meaningful little moments are what are the crux of those. So it kind of hits to me home when the things you decide on a moment to moment, personal or little things like that, they do have ramifications. I think that direct translation there was like a big part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I was kind of curious for you. Did you,
Hmm.
I mean, with all the characters and the different interactions, we talked a little bit about these two. What, there were so many of the other characters that like resonated with me. Like, was there any like really that you had favored, or like you were like, oh, whenever they got screen time, it was like a treat?
I really like Jeremy Irons' character, Tiberius, I think is his name, because
Yeah.
he's just like he's the most like that's good casting. You're like we need like a grizzled guy, and he's got like an eye scar, and he's like I'm a cynical old man, and I'm going here living, and and he's just like I've got my fucking knights here, like whatever
Yeah,
he's
every
saying,
time he talked, it hurt me. I was like, that hurts him, I bet. And I feel like the pain he's going through.
Right, like it's just like give him a scar. Like he already had a scar when he was a talking lion, but give him one again. Like it's perfect. I really love him, and then I really like. I think he doesn't even have a name, but the character he's the Knight Hospitalis is how he's referred to, with played by David Thewlis.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
David Thewlis. Yeah,
yeah,
there was a running theory. I don't know if you heard about this, that he's
hmm
not a knight, right? He's really like God in disguise,
yeah, like a
or like
like God or like an angel or
an
something,
angel. Yeah.
which I think like makes a lot of sense when especially when there's those two scenes which kind of give credence to the theory where like he's in the desert and he just looks and he's gone, and then when Orlando Bloom is like laying like seemingly dead after that attack, and he goes and like touches him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because they never like straight up are like, oh yeah, this guy is an angel, or he's like the voice of God, or he's whatever, or he's a saint or something. Because I know there was like a saint who was like in the Night Hospitalis, so that was like kind of I was like wondering if
Mm,
that was like kind of my theory. But they never like they just give you hints of it.
yeah.
It's really well done. I think that stuff might have been cut out completely of the theatrical, but yeah, it is one of those things that's back in the extended. And yeah, so it just kind of gives you just enough hints to wonder about that.
I think my favorite. I mean, I love David Thewlis's character. I think my favorite, and it's because of just one line that has stuck with me for this whole movie. It's not even like pertinent to anything story, but it's like I once fought for 2 days with an arrow through my testicle for
Yeah,
Liam Neeson's Godfrey. I
yeah,
was like, what? You can't, like, he had that in his back pocket. He was waiting for a reason to use it, and he could use it anytime. He could just be like, "Sir, we're short on rations." Something's like, "Nope, just say that."
yeah.
Shuts
So
him up.
'cause when he says it, like one of the other guys is like, I remember that. It's like, oh, here he comes with the testicle story
I've heard
again.
the story so many times. Yeah, him and the guy that like has so few lines, but to me coincides with that feeling of like it wasn't just Godfrey that was badass; his whole
Hmm.
team was. The Viking guy that was in his group when he got
Yeah,
shot in the neck and then he like gets up and keeps fighting. I was like, these guys, like, a normal troop would have just been just massacred off of that ambush, but like they put out a huge fight
yeah.
with like their few numbers. I'm like, I kind of like that. Like it made it. match what, like, a lot of times they'll say a character is, well regarded or known throughout the lands, which they do a good job of doing for Godfrey and his house and everything. But like those actions at the beginning, those few moments we get with them, I really like it stuck with me and it made me feel like, yeah, I believe it.
Definitely. And I love that you get introduced to this group and you think, okay, like these are going to be like our guys throughout the movie. This is good, like when Robin Hood meets his merry men or whatever.
Yeah,
And and then they're like, and they're badasses, and they're like, like, like you said, there's like the Viking guy, there's a character who I think is supposed to be maybe like a Moor or something like that. Like it's an interesting, diverse group. And you're like, okay, cool, this is going to be our crew. And then they all essentially, except for David Thewlis, get wiped out in like that next scene. Liam Neeson hangs on for a bit enough for him to be like,
knights him.
knights him, and makes him like he inherits his title, because that character is, he's like his dad and stuff, and so that he kind of gets this carried over. But yeah, like those characters, you think they're going to be there the whole movie, they're kind of wiped out, and then you get to Jerusalem and you have a whole new crew of characters. I thought that was interesting because it's like, yeah, he is kind of like these people who we thought was going to be around to protect him. Like, no, he's just kind of on his own. I thought that was pretty. That was an interesting way to take it. Yeah,
I feel like he had a few people that were with him. The hospitaller. He eventually like befriends the leper king and Jeremy Irons' character, and then he kind of just like, here's your land, turn it into what you will. And he's like, I'm going to develop the irrigation system. And I'm a jack of all trades. I know. I'm not just a blacksmith. I'm a Renaissance man.
Right? Yeah, and I love that all that stuff about, because it kind of like, it's like, oh, you making your own destiny, like you have this just dirt patch, and that's like a running theme. That's when he has that first conversation with the Leper King, and they're playing chess or whatever. He's like, a king can move a man or whatever. It's very metaphorical.
Soul.
Mm-hmm. And so it's all about, this movie's all about kind of like making your own destiny, and that's the big reason why he goes to Jerusalem, is making his own destiny, finding redemption for both himself and then his wife.
Yeah.
He wants to seek to atone and to be his own person, but he is still like doing that on this thing that he inherited. And at the end of it, I love that, that's kind of one of the running themes of the movie, is just like being your own person and just accepting fate and accepting destiny, but also moving with it. And I love that he's able to, like, when Jerusalem is, to skip to the end a little bit, when Jerusalem is getting attacked and overtaken, he realizes like there's nothing to stop this, but what we can do is we can save the people.
Yeah. He's like, that's what matters. It's not so much like, what are we, I think it kind of, he has this moment, it seemed to me, and I'm curious what you think of, like, this whole time the film starts with the death of his wife and kid. And he's at loss, and he's trying to find purpose in life, and he's trying to find meaning and atone for maybe wrongdoings he's done. And he finds his father. They're part of this larger this crusade and everything, and what that all means. And then I feel like when he gets there and he's like, oh, I'll go to where Jesus was crucified, and he doesn't find it. He doesn't feel what he needed to feel there. Like he talks about that. And so I think it's just him constantly trying to figure out his purpose, and people giving him, because of just him remaining true to himself more morally. It's just, he finds himself in different situations throughout it. And then by the end of it, he, I think, just vocalizes a lot of that and says like, look, it's not these, at least it may be in a grandstanding way, and it might be like a little like in your face, but it was very much like, it's not the stones that make you true closer to God or not, or whatever you pray to, but it's just like who you are and the people that you're around. So it's like, that's what we need to make sure matters. And like, he kept pointing to that one priest that like lived throughout the whole battle, and he was like, you've taught me a lot about religion over these last couple of days, because he kept doing like, God will forgive us. It's he wills it. Like, they need to die before we do. Like, we got to save ourselves. And it's like, I see you. I see you. So it's interesting, his character arc over all that, and like, yeah.
Yeah, no, he's got a really interesting arc, and I think you're bringing up a lot of good points, because I think this movie is very anti-fanaticism. Like, it's, there's all these things in it that are like, oh, like you mentioned, he goes and he buries his wife's cross at like the where Jesus was supposedly crucified, and it's so Jerusalem is this spot that is means a lot to both the Christians and the Muslims fighting over it, and I think Saladin puts it so well when at the end he after he's surrendered and he says, "What does Jerusalem mean?" and he goes, "Nothing, everything." Like that's so succinct and to the point where it's like, yeah, this is just a place. And there's a lot of stuff, especially with the Night Hospitalis, that's like basically saying like the movie feels like it's not anti-faith, it's not anti like because it's very in fact I'd say it's like pro faith and pro like personal belief and stuff like that, whether it be a Christian or Muslim or Judaism, which they mention quite a bit in this movie as well, or
Yeah.
any other faith. It's more like anti like the zealotry, the
Yeah, yeah.
and which is embodied in these religious fanatics.
God wills it. God wills it. Yeah,
God
like
wills it.
whatever. Yeah, whatever they got.
Right. And that the ultimate example of that being the Templars, who are these people who are they run around crosses on them and they kill. They're like, in the name of God, we're killing you. And you see like characters like that on both of the Christian and Muslim sides, but especially the Knights Templars are the ones who are really
Yeah,
representing that. Those guys are some real motherfuckers.
Reynald de Chatillon, Brendan Gleeson's character,
Right.
like he got a chance to ham it up a lot.
Dude,
When he
he was
just
having a good time in this movie, being a real bastard.
just like if there was anyone polar opposite of Daniel Day-Lewis's character, it was his. It was like he was the utmost of morality, and he was like the most despicable side of people, groveling, sniveling, weaselly, just doing harm for harm's sake.
Mhm.
And it was also like an acceptance of himself too, where he's like, I know what I am, I know what my purpose in life is,
Mhm.
and coming to terms, I was like, oh, that's scary to a degree of like how he's so nonchalant about it. And
Mhm.
like I love the scenes I love the most with him was when he was in his cell, where he was just like,
Doing his
"No,
little
no, shut down."
walk.
And then like he would climb the hedges, just trying to annoy the shit out of all the guards.
That was such a good scene. I also love the scene where he like the Leopard King takes off his glove and he kisses, he's like slobbering all over, and it's just like
Yeah,
so gross. And then also when he just gets beheaded, it's just like good. Like fuck this guy. Like that's such a great scene.
it was so gruesome. Yeah. Whereas, what's his name? The Guy
Hmm.
Martin Sakas, I think is how you say
Martin Kosaks, I think.
Cossacks. Yeah.
Yeah.
His character always felt like he felt like the human. He felt very mirroring of Balin's character, where while Balin was tempted and he resisted in many cases, Guy was very much like tempted and kept succumbing to it. And like it just showed him like just his look on his face, just like, yes, I'm giving into this guilt, I'm giving into this sin and all these things and justifying it and finding ways to rationalize it. It's like there's a lot of interesting reflections in character dichotomies here that I was like, oh, this is you if you went down this path, this is you if you went down this path for a lot of different people.
I think their kind of back and forth throughout the whole movie is just so interesting because Balin is constantly, having mercy for him. This guy, they're like mortal enemies, but he just constantly has mercy for him. They're, obviously he's in love with his wife, who, she only ends up marrying him, Guy, because like of the arranged marriage, and he has a chance at one point to basically get him executed, and maybe for the greater good.
Mhm.
But he doesn't do it. Which originally, when I saw this, I was like really pissed at that. I was like, no, just fucking kill that guy. He sucks. But then also you're like, okay, like I get it. Like he's an idealist. Not only would he die, but like also like all of his knights would just be like executed and wiped out. And I think there's an important moment that kind of gives you an insight into Guy's thinking there, or into Balin's thinking there, which is when he first gets to Jerusalem and he
Hmm.
sees the Knights Templar being hanged, who because for doing bad things, because they murdered Muslims, like it's.
Yeah.
But he's like, oh well, they're getting executed for basically doing what the Pope would have them do, and it's like, yeah, these guys are awful, shitty people, but they are still like doing what is in line with their code, and he would just basically be committing genocide on all the Knights Templar. So it is interesting and it's complex. It's like, is for the greater good ever good? And like it's like the line you mentioned earlier about, oh, do a little bit of evil now for a greater good later on. Because yeah, if he kills him, then chain reaction never happens. He becomes like the overseer of Jerusalem or whatever. He doesn't become king, and Jerusalem doesn't fall. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's. I kept thinking of that line in Thor Ragnarok when they're like, Asgard is not a people, or Asgard is not a place, it's a people.
Mm.
That's what it reminds me of. Is he's ultimately, this land, and what we're talking about, like, it's a holy site, but that's only because like people have decided it's like a holy site. It means something to these people. They're fighting over it. And Jeremy Irons has that line. He's like, I thought this was originally about holy lands, but it's all about economies and blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, the Kingdom of Jerusalem is just basically invaders, like the colonizers just coming and taking over. So
Yeah.
maybe it's not a bad thing that they got kicked out at the end. I don't know. What did you think about any of that?
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
I think it was interesting. I think, yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts on that because
I know I went through a lot right there.
I mean, like, I guess in particularly, like, I thought the struggles of what he had essentially of like, look, I could do these harms. I could. It's like what he observes and like what he takes in, and it was funny because to me it was a lot of like. There was numerous times where Balin's character would be like a line would be thrown his way, he'd listen to it, and then later the line would be thrown back in a different context. Like him with Saladin's like right hand man when he first met him, he's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
you will know your enemies will know your reputation before you even such and such." It comes up again later. It comes up, and then like he does his own version of it. It's like little quippy moments. I feel like he was very much a sponge in the world, and it was almost rewatching it now. Some of that took me out of it a little bit, of like a little too much. Like, man, this guy like he does it all. Like he knows everything. He does. He's a little too good. And I was like, okay. I mean, it within the world that they created, it made sense. That's the part that I was like, I think if it was in any other film, it would have distracted, been really distracting and a detriment to the film of like having this super altruistic, super ideal, as they said, the perfect knight, right? But in this, where like they were such a hyper emphasized versions of like here's good, here's evil, here's this oncoming threat. It works. Like the environment and the tone they set, like it overall made sense. And again, I kind of just go back, given this being about the extended versions, I just don't see how like this is to me not an extended version. This is the version. So like if you were to, like, I don't know how. When you're telling larger stories, and we're seeing a little bit more normalization, maybe due to streaming, I think in large part of like how films like this can be made or are made more commonly now. Like you'll see The Irishman is like a 4-hour cut. You'll see what was Scorsese's latest one?
Killers of the Flower Moon.
That one also kind of like a longer cut. There was no two versions of it. That was the version of it. I'm wondering if we'll get a chance. Granted, the budgets need to be there, and I feel like we're on an uprising of like an uptick of like, oh, movies are kind of more back again in some ways. We went through some struggles as within the strikes, within the COVID stuff, but I think now if we get the next set of directors opportunities to do epics like this, do you think we'll see this length, this style of film, like this much broad out storytelling being done? Well, do you have any thoughts on I guess on that aspect of it?
Like all of those things you said are really reasons why are getting director's cuts and why we have so many opportunities to tell these longer versions of stories. And part of it's that, part of it's because like there are now like fan movements and stuff like that where people are like, well, this movie didn't work. I want to see like the director's true vision. And sometimes I would say that, there's not always like there's not a good version of David Lynch's Dune, because like necessarily. And people are like always asking David Lynch for that. He's like, it doesn't exist, or he's like, it might exist, but not the way you want. But
like,
then
for your prior films, I haven't had a chance to see a lot of those movies, but like, what has been largely the reason for in the past director's cuts to exist? It's either a true vision, like you said, and to me that means certain storylines or compression of film. Like, right? Like it's usually those two.
Well, yeah, so I think that notably this movie comes out in 2005, right? Which is around the time you start to see every DVD comes with like the extended cut or the version you never saw before, or like, like even comedies, there would be like a lot of comedies that would have like the unrated cuts, whatever it might be. That became really prevalent from like right around when DVDs were starting to hit. And I think a big part of the reason is because of DVDs and now streaming. Like it is so easy to get this, like it wasn't one I covered in the extended editions, but I talked about the Spider-Man 3 editor's cut. And now that's when you could just like go and, watch it on DVD or rent it for like $3 on Amazon or whatever. Like it's easy to see these alternate versions, but it's also easy for filmmakers to have these versions readily available. Like one of the great lost alternate cuts of all time is Orson Welles' The Magnificent Ambersons. Like the ending of that movie was like redone and reshot, and like the studio made him change everything, and we just don't have his old version. Like it's gone. The film it's on is just destroyed. But because this movie, even though it was still shot at a time when everything was shot on film, and it was shot on film, this was Ridley Scott's first movie ever where he edited it on digital. So it was all the film was completely scanned onto digital, and so when they were editing the director's cut, they also, or when they're editing the theatrical to be like, okay, here you go, to Warner Brothers or whoever put it out, they're like, all right, here's the theatrical, but or 20th Century Fox, here's the theatrical cut. They were also editing because they didn't have to physically chop up the film anymore, because they had the digital version of it. They were editing the director's cut at the same time, knowing this is gonna be the true version. We're going to put this out for people to watch on DVD. So I think because of technology, because of things like digital editing, because of streaming, because of DVDs, these things have really taken a hike in popularity.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think something to evaluate there is also like business models and the changing of that. Like you said, like Blu-rays, DVDs. Now with streaming, I feel like the way in which it's approached is similar and different in some ways. I saw in an interview recently with the famous director's cut man himself, Zack Snyder. He was talking about it, and he was like, "Look, studios want my films, and then he wants one version, which is like he's like, I want this R-rated. Like for instance, with the recent one where it's like part Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, he wanted to do like this R-rated cut of it." And I'm abbreviating here, so I would recommend finding his Netflix interview about this. But he's like, I wanted to make that. They compromised, says, look, we'll launch with a PG, like a cut version of it, compressed or whatever, and we'll do part 1 and part 2, and then afterwards we'll do the other ones to give it like an additional life. It's like it reintroduces it with a more appeal in the streaming audiences at a later stage. And it's like, okay, now you took one movie and you've been able to extend its lifespan for like initial launching to viewers over the course of like multiple like different launches. You got part 1, part 2, part 1 uncut, part 2 uncut. And I think it's a similar fashion with the old ways of like DVDs and Blu-rays, where you have the theatrical cut, and then when it comes out to Blu-ray DVD, you'll get the version you never got a chance to see in theaters. And then you'll be like incentivized to go. It's just interesting to me, like how it's some things remain the same and some things are evolving, like how they tackle it. I think other directors are just like, oh, because it's streaming, you can watch this at home. Here's the 6-hour cut of my movie. Pause it when you want. Like I can't do that in the theater.
Yeah, no, I think you have a really good point, because like that's one thing Scott did kind of talk about in some of those behind the scenes features. He's like, and I talked about like Scott is one of those guys who still has the juice to make all these movies. He makes like a movie every year or so. Like,
Yeah.
he had two movies that came out in a year not too long ago. And I think it's because he understands the studio politics. He's like, I am making, like, this is art, but it also, while it is art and it has to, fulfill all these things and tell this, like, really great story, it also has to make money for the studios. He's like, I'm only able to make these movies because the studios give me money. So he realizes, like, I ultimately have to deliver the product that the studios want, and he's like, yeah, I'll deliver that theatrical cut. And you have seen that happen a number of times with Ridley Scott, where he, like, with this, or like Blade Runner, or I'm assuming with Napoleon, all these movies that, go out into the theaters that, are of a length that is a normal theatrical length, that are okay, they're whatever, and then you get, like, the true, like, the real version. Like, when you watch, like, with this one, or when you watch Blade Runner or something, you're gonna watch the director's cut. Like, I don't know anybody who watches the version of Blade Runner that has, like, or, like, doesn't have the unicorn, doesn't have the voiceover, or has the voiceover.
That's what I'm gonna ask. Has there ever been a case where you prefer the non-extended non-director's cut of a film?
That's a good question. One I covered a while back on this was my guest Alex Calleros came on, and he had us. He pitched us The New World, the Terrence Malick film, and admittedly, I haven't watched the director's cut, but the points he was making all made sense. Where it's like, Malick is a director who just kind of, like, will have, like, a shot of a butterfly for, like, 15 minutes or whatever the fuck, And so to have, like, a tighter version of it, I think worked. I think I'll say, because I do love the director's cuts of the Lord of the Rings, right? I think they're great, and that's something, to speak on what you were saying earlier about, like, sometimes you've got to deliver, like, a shorter movie, and I especially love watching the director's cuts, like, and do it in a marathon or something. But sometimes I don't want to watch the 4-hour, 15-minute cut of Return of the King. Sometimes I'm good with the 3-hour cut.
Wow.
Sometimes
that cut deep. You had to pick that one of all movies. That's the one you picked. I don't know how you.
How about you? Wait, is there a? You're putting me on the spot. I'm gonna put you on the spot. What's the theatrical cut that you think is better than or that you prefer to watch over the?
I vocalized it just because I'm like, I can't think of a time where I do prefer the theatrical. I guess it'd have to be Blade Runner. I mean, no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I don't know. Yeah, none really come to mind. I'm always like, I guess, I feel like it's like those that want director's cuts, or like the appeal of it is just like, this is a story that we wanted to tell, and now you get to marinate in it more. And I'm always like a glutton for that. Like, I feel like you enjoy all the bonus features, you enjoy all the extra stuff, so we're just inclined for more. I think honestly, if there was a version, I feel like there's movies that there were, like I said, the Scorsese films, the Irishman and the Killer of the Flower Moon. I almost feel like, personal opinion, Killer of the Flower Moon could have used a theatrical cut. Yeah. If that was the director's cut, I would have liked a little bit more of a tighter film. But I think that's like for something that doesn't exist. I don't think there's anything out that I know I prefer an existing theatrical cut. I don't have any response there.
Yeah, I mean, my inclination is to say make maybe a horror movie, because I feel like horror movies work when they're a lot, like, tighter and stuff like that. But being said, like, the first movie I covered in this series, and it's not out at the time we're recording this, but it'll obviously be out at the time people are listening, is Mike Flanagan's director's cut of Doctor Sleep, and that's a 3-hour horror movie, and it was in, like, the director's cut is so much better. So I don't know, like, maybe I'm even wrong on that.
I think every time it's pretty consistently and unanimously that director's cuts or extended cuts are always, like, usually have more quality to them.
Yeah, even when, it's something that the director might not be involved with necessarily. Like the editor's cut of Spider-Man 2, like, one I talked about in the series, the editor's cut of Alien 3, because I feel like, with Flanagan, obviously, being the writer, editor, and director of Doctor Sleep, it's his movie. Like, he's as close to his auteur as you can be. But in most cases, and films are not just from directors. Films are also from editors. They're, who obviously do the cuts. They're also from writers. We talked about this being Billy Monahan's film. him doing the screenplay. And that's one thing Ridley Scott credits is he's like, yeah, he's like, I'm a director. There's people, and I do some writing stuff, but he's like, I don't like, he's not the originator of scripts because he's like, there's people who are better at that than me.
Mm.
And he's kind of like, that's the interesting one thing, like when they were doing all the rewrites, whether there was like the with the boy version with that, there was almost a director's cut before the movie even came out. So I think that it is, yeah, it's interesting because I feel like director's cuts do kind of put a lot of, and that's why I call this extended editions, because
Mhm.
it's not just solely the director's cut. It is also the editor and all these other people going back and getting to see these other things, and putting in, speak on actors, like put it back in actors that got cut out of the film. Now you're getting to see the whole dynamic between Michael Sheen, who you don't know is his half brother in the
Right.
and getting to see his performance. So it's really giving you a much more holistic view of the movie on all aspects in a lot of the time. Yeah.
I have a question, dude.
Right.
There are things that have improved with the director's cut and extended cut here. Was there anything that it would either version you just like? What were the areas you didn't enjoy as much with the film?
I mean, the theatrical, there was definitely a lot that felt rushed and not great. I
I have one. If you want to
Okay.
think about yours, he I thought excessively used the lowering of frame rates for dramatic effect a lot. Like it was good a couple of times, but then there was like one time where the oil is just spilling on the kid's hand, and I'm like, why do we need to like slow the frames down? Like it didn't, it
Yeah.
didn't make sense. Other times there was like there's a lot of crazy action or like
Mhm.
there's a lot of motion going on that like that effect like added some distortion to it or like taken out of body experience to it. But yeah, I just felt like he just kept turning that dial on of like, yeah, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here.
Yeah, there. Okay, so I did say, like in the theatrical, it really bugged me when he didn't kill Guy. It bugged me less than the extended, but one moment that I thought was I get what he was going for, but it was a little cheesy. Was when
Mm.
the Knight Templar like pokes him, and he like is implied to come back to life. Because like I get what they're doing there. Like if he would have just like done something different, like if he would have just like stood over him or like waved
Yeah.
his hand, something like that. But I don't know why, but it just felt
little
really
too-
cheesy. It's like poke, you're back to life. That like I kind of laughed at that point, and it wasn't supposed to be funny.
Yeah. I think the other thing too, I keep forgetting that Gladiator came out in 2000,
Yeah.
right? And so I loved the choreography of the action in that film.
Mhm.
Like I think it speaks for itself. This film, I think it wasn't its primary goal or intention, but I would have liked a few more really polished choreographed, fights
Mhm.
or something, or like even large scale combat stuff. I felt like it was maybe not the right term, but it's sometimes I was questioning whether it was at odds with itself. It was like, okay, we're doing these scaled fights, we're doing these larger things, but then it just kind of like felt like a tier down, or maybe he didn't have the budget he did or the team he did for the prior film. I don't know, but I felt like there was a little bit of polish that could have been added in some of those areas. Not to
Mhm.
say it was bad. It was just having compared it to Gladiator, I saw it on a higher level there. And I'm like, I wanted a little bit more. I loved the beginning stuff where his father teaches him and trains him how to fight that style that he was told, and it kept like sampling it. And I think the only time we really got like a really cool, just one-on-one focused thing was at the end, after everything had transpired, Jerusalem had been surrendered. Him and Guy have that little duel.
Yeah.
That was like, okay, we're getting it. And I was very happy. And I was like, that reminded me. I'm like, oh yeah, they did Gladiator. I wanted
Right. Yeah.
more,
Yeah.
I guess, a little bit more of that, but
Yeah.
it's
Well,
fine.
Ridley Scott. Yeah, he's obviously he's like all really famous for making these epic films, and yeah, this one it felt like they're the like kind of big epic battle, which in a lot of war epics like would have been kind of more parsed throughout the film. There was just kind of one big long siege that is the last 30 minutes or however long of the film is kind of like that. So it felt like they saved a lot of that for the end, at least of like the big battle, like the massive ones with all the extras and like the towers on fire and
Yeah. And it
all
did
that
feel
stuff.
it felt like there was maybe some inspiration taken from Return of the King, by the way,
Mm,
when they were sieging the Jerusalem and there was like the giant towers, like some of the shots of like the open field
mhm.
before like taking the castle, like the giant tower things and everything. I was like, that almost looks like a frame that if you just put it in with Gondor, I would have been like,
Mhm.
that's Return
Right.
of the King, which is cool. Like I like that.
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
okay, it's just maybe drawing some inspiration. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wanted to circle back to something that it touches on that final siege, but it feels like it ties really well into the themes we were talking about earlier of like, yeah, this is a city being assaulted and attacked, and how Orlando Bloom throughout the course of this movie, like he's aiming to be like the perfect knight, but it starts with him like committing this crime, like murdering his brother, and in the you have a lot, you understand why in the extended edition, but
yeah,
it's still like it's still murder, not a great look, and I think that's why he's like trying so hard to like not kill Guy and to not do all these things, that he's trying to find his own redemption and to atone for the sins of the past. And I feel like Jerusalem itself is kind of like dealing with the same thing. Like this is a city that was taken by force. Like the people, they mentioned the people inside were slaughtered, and then Christians have ruled it for 100 years. And then he gives this speech as like, we are paying for offenses that were committed before we were born,
yeah,
and the city is being taken, and it feels like the city has to be kind of redeemed for its past, and the people living inside have to be redeemed for the sins of their ancestors, is the same way that he is going on his personal arc. And I love that whenever like a movie can mirror what's going on the micro scale also on the macro scale.
yeah.
and
You're
and
right.
that thing that he says when he's talking to Saladin, and he's like, when Christians took this city, they massacred, they murdered, they did all this stuff. And Saladin, who is great, he's much more like the Leper King and stark opposite. He's like the opposite of Guy and Renaud and all these guys. And he says, "I am not those men." Like that is one of my. I had to write that note in my
Yeah.
notes. Like that
I,
is one of the greatest lines of the movie, I think.
I honestly like just the portrayal of the Muslims and
Mm.
Saladin and Middle Easterns in general in this film was some of the better stuff I've seen at that time period, because everything
Yeah,
was always very stereotypical, very angry, very
yeah.
messed up, and it was like a polar. There's just like a reverse role there of like all the Christians are fanatical, crazy, and like that was. I remember growing up, like when I was a kid, I was watching that. I was like, they're they're level-headed. They're smart. They're not lashing out. They're like we that could be portrayed. I know as an
Yeah.
Iranian myself, I was like, this is refreshing.
Right, and it's crazy. Like this movie comes out in 2005, so he's shooting it in like 2003, 2004. So this is just like a couple years after 9/11, when
Yeah,
like everything was like you were saying, like portraying like Islamic people and like like Middle Easterners, like very like even like 300, which comes out
yeah,
like years after this, is like, look out, scary brown people, like it's insane. And yeah, this is, like you said, very level-headed. It portrays both like Christians and Muslims of being like capable of like great good and great evil, and it's
yeah,
so balanced. And interestingly enough, like when this movie was getting made, there was like people were attacking it for both being too anti-Muslim and too pro-Muslim. Like there was one article that came out that said this is Osama bin Laden's version of history, like, and it's just like insane that. And
wow,
yeah, like the fact that it feels so like even keeled and like respectful, and it's like it's not Islamophobic at all, when so much media at the time, like you go back and watch some of that stuff and you're like, oh, this is really cringy and bad. But like I think it, even compared to a lot of stuff today, it's a really nuanced and powerful portrayal of Middle Easterners.
yeah. It was very yeah. I remember just at that time that was when I was younger. It resonated with me, just like how it portrayed them and how it. I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of refreshing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, do you have any do you have any other like parts of this movie though that you found like really powerful or interesting?
I would say. There's so many little bits in it, and I think one of the things, like I joked earlier about Godfrey's moments, like the moments with Godfrey really stuck with me, and just him, the presence he carried as an actor and as a character. Liam Neeson is Liam Neeson, and I'm like, oh, even if he was like he was a squire, I would have still been like, wait a second, I gotta like pay this man respect. But like he comes into when he first meets Balin, and he was like, I come here looking for forgiveness, and the humbleness of which that like it felt like there was a gentle side to him, and a kind of like a genuineness of all of that like really resonated with me, of like how he approached it, how he was understanding that he may not get it. He was just like, look, I know I wronged you, I wronged this my stuff. I am who I am. I accept that, but I come asking nonetheless. And he does, and then kind of flash forward a little bit where he's like about to pass, and he knights Balin, and what's his name? The hospitaller is like, do you want forgiveness for all of your sins? And he's like, all but one. And I was like I, again, just like everything between that, I'm always a sucker for like good, well handled like father son dynamics in fashions like this one, and that really like was the way they handled that was like very gentle and very subtle, but very powerful, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think.
How about you?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the interactions, and I touched on this earlier, but between Saladin and the king, that stuff was always so fascinating and interesting, because it's these two guys who realize that like their worlds want to destroy each other, and Saladin knows that it's like his like solemn mission to take back Jerusalem, and that he will probably do that at some point after this king is dead, but they both want peace. Like, unlike the rest of the world, which is like tearing itself apart, I love at the end, after Orlando Bloom finally finds some peace, you see that Richard the Lionheart is going back, and he's like ready. And I wish there was a part of me that wishes like it had been Danny Houston who played Richard the Lionheart. Like, no disrespect to the guy who plays him, but
oh no, did you recognize who played him?
It's Ian Glenn from Game of Thrones.
Yeah. I was like, what? I heard his voice. I'm like, oh shit.
Right, but the reason I said it is because Ridley Scott would go on to do a Robin Hood movie, which I kind of, in my mind, is like a sequel to this, because it's Robin Hood coming back from the Crusades and Richard the next Crusade, and Richard the Lionheart's in that. I was like, oh, it would have been so cool if it had been the same actor. But yeah, like all the stuff with like Saladin and him felt so really powerful and interesting. And I gotta shout out the actor. Like, it's once again something that was really cool about this movie in a time when you would get like a British actor, or get like, getting like, oh, we need to have like, in the 91 Robin Hood, they're like, we need to have someone play an Islamic Moor. Who are we going to get? Morgan Freeman. Like, okay. Or like, oh, who are we going to get to play the 13th Warrior? Antonio Banderas, but it's mostly actors who playing like the Saladin and the Muslim leaders. It's mostly actors who are not like American or British actors. It's like actually Arabian act. Like the guy who plays Saladin is a Syrian actor, who I don't think spoke even much English at the time that he made this movie. And a lot of those actors are, actors from outside the Western world that Western audiences wouldn't know at all. That would eventually like go on to, through this play in other films and stuff like that, and get wider recognition. Like I think he went on to be in like Pirates of the Caribbean and stuff like that. But I thought that was a really all those moments were really cool, and it lends itself to the authenticity of this movie, that it feels like instead of like taking the shortcuts with the casting or with the storytelling or any of these aspects, they really went full out, especially in this director's cut.
Yeah, I loved Saladin's sidekick or second in command. I think his name was Imad. That actor is in a ton of stuff as well, and I like the time he was on screen. I really appreciate it, and I was like, oh, he's got a watchful eye. He's observant in a way that was like reading. He's like reading character and intention and stuff. And I guess, if there was more opportunity to do more with him, I would have been happy with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Any final thoughts on the movie here before we wrap up?
go see the director's cut, rent it. You know what's funny? You said you saw it through Blu-ray.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to like find. I know I have the Blu-ray somewhere. I was trying to just find it online, and it was kind of hard to find online. I had to really go looking for my Blu-ray because like everywhere I was looking on streaming services, they weren't offering the director's cut as a very straightforward viewing experience. So my big push for streaming services is make extended cuts or director's cuts of movies just as easy to find as whatever original versions of the films there are. But overall, it was a treat to watch this movie again. I very much enjoyed the story. I very much enjoyed the epic, and I enjoyed talking about it with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll echo what you're saying. Definitely, things are a lot easier to find than they were 20, 30 years ago with these kind of cuts where you'd have to like have a friend who had some recorded like something somehow. And, there are ways to do it now, but like, it's still not super always easily available. Like the one I talked about last week, Black Hat, like that is really tough to find, the Michael Mann's version of that anywhere. You have to get like the Arrow video DVD. But yeah, they are becoming more widely available, and I think that they need to become even more so viewable. And it's interesting because the version I watched is technically, because there's technically three versions. There's the theatrical, there's the director, and then there's the version called the Director's Roadshow version, which I guess Ridley Scott like took like on, did as like a roadshow where he would show it in like a city or whatever. And that was one of the ways that he got word out for the director's cut. And it's the same exact movie as the director's cut, but he brings back, because this is an epic, he brings back the little interlude. Like there's like actually like a intermission in the movie where they like play music for like 5 minutes. And then there's like what do you call it? I'm spacing on the name for it, but like at the beginning of the movie. Not previews, but like, when they just play music at the beginning of a movie. They used to do it like all the time in like old movies and like Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
So there's that.
I don't know the name.
It adds like another like 5 minutes or something on top of it. I watched it that way, just to say I could, and like it would be cool. And then I got up and go to the bathroom during the intermission, which which is what I feel like Killers of the Flower Moon would have benefited from, honestly. Like bring back intermissions, for Endgame or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really dug this movie. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it. And I'm really glad that I was able to end this this extended edition series talking about a movie that I feel like. I think I would think that honestly, I said something earlier on in the series, but I think I will change my stance and say this is the movie that I think jumps the most from being a theatrical edition to a director's cuts.
Salahuddin would say went from nothing and became everything.
Yes, there you go. Very, very well put. But yeah, I mean, are there any other director's cuts or anything you want to mention like that, or your favorites, or anything about director's cuts or extended editions?
There's one movie in particular that I can't watch. Like it's unwatchable for me, the theatrical version, and it's not that it's unwatchable, it's that I've just so ingrained in my head the version of Tarantino's True Romance.
Okay.
The Tarantino cut, like that is the version for me. The other version is non-existent or pales in comparison. Just the way it's weaved, the way it's cut, the way it's everything. That I think the obvious answer, I was trying to avoid saying it, I'm just going to quickly throw it in, is what you took a shot at earlier, is the Lord of the Rings extended.
You don't feel like watching, but it is. The extended cuts the extended cuts are magnificent, especially 1 and 2. I feel like are like perfect, So yeah. No, I the Lord of the Rings are amazing. I wouldn't cover them on this because any version of it is not underrated. But they're great movies. The only other one I will throw out that I haven't mentioned at all in this series is I wanted to find a way to talk about fan cuts, but I never really found a good movie to cover. The only one that I would talk about is one we've already covered, which is The Thief and the Cobbler. Which have you seen? Yeah,
I have not seen that.
Okay, because there's like the Miramax version of it that came out because Richard Williams spent 30 years working on it. It was about to come out. He didn't finish it. They put out this really hobbled version where they put in like Disney-esque songs, and it's really not great. You can tell from when the animation goes from being here's something that a guy hand drew over 40 years to here's something that a studio did in 2 weeks.
Okay.
But there is a version online called the Recobbled Cut, which is you can find on YouTube for free. It's like stitched together with like storyboards and stuff like that, but it's still an incredible viewing experience. I would recommend that. I know I haven't watched it yet. I know I was taking some shots at it earlier. There's like a 3-hour cut of David Lynch's Dune that I might check out if I have a lot of time on my hands.
Sure.
So those are some other ones I wanted to throw out.
You mentioned fan cut. I believe Topher Grace did 2. He did
the Phantom edit.
The Phantom edit, and then didn't he also do? I thought he did a fan edit of the Hobbit trilogy, but like condensed into one film.
I think you're right. That would be really interesting. I haven't checked out either of those, but I hear really good things about them.
I've enjoyed them. Like they were. Yeah. I wouldn't say like I would take them over the other stuff in any way. It's not bad either. It was a cool, different way of viewing these things of like the way he cut them. So I was very, very much into it.
The one I would like to see, if I was ever going to do like a fan edit, I would do Pirates of the Caribbean 2 and 3, where I would condense them into one movie because they honestly should have been one movie. It's weird that they're two because it's like all the other Pirates of the Caribbean are pretty standalone, and it's just like a weird 2-part thing. So I think you could really, because there's a lot of padding in those movies where they're just like running away from like kind of racist portrayals of like natives and stuff like that, and it's just like it doesn't really add anything. It's just Benny Hill sequences. Yeah. So I think you could really make that like a really incredible movie if you edited that down. Oh. That's the fan edit I want to see. But yep. Anyway, thank you so much for being on. This was an absolute blast. I think it was the perfect ending to the extended edition quartet of films I talked about. Kurosh, where can the people find more of your stuff?
They can find me on all social medias at Cujo Prime. I'm primarily on YouTube, so check me out there at youtube.com/@CujoPrime. You can find all my game reviews, interviews, impressions there. And yeah, that's most of my stuff. Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. And if anybody out there, you're listening to this for the first time because you're a fan of Kurosh's, you can check out my stuff, Underrated Movie Podcast. Just look that up anywhere. It's on all the podcast apps. It's on YouTube. You can also, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/underrated movie podcast called Underrated Disc 2, where I do bonus podcast called Underdogs. Episodes also come out a week early and ad-free there. A lot of other cool stuff. And then also want to shout out the other podcasts that I do, Midnight Film Society, where on Mondays, where this podcast is not released, Damien and I, my friend, talk about newly released movies and upcoming stuff, just kind of more general what we've been watching type podcast. So check that out too. But yeah, Kurosh, thank you once again for coming on. I'll give you the last word.
Salam alaikum.